You may have been watching on this channel breakdowns of Tony Robbins, of Richard Bandler, of Russell Brand, of many people like this, and whenever I talk about Sleight of Mouth, it tends to go a bit all over the place. I know, sorry about that. I understand that some beginners may be confused about where to start and what to study first. Therefore, in this video, I want to make a complete process for learning for anybody who is starting with Sleight of Mouth. It is designed to be an introduction video that will cover the most important aspects of that art, that is Sleight of Mouth, and how can you use it whenever you are in the middle of a conversation. Initially, Sleight of Mouth was developed and popularized by Robert Dilts and Doug O'Brien. You can find their respective books on Amazon or anywhere else you can find them. We are going to give a brief overview of all of the patterns one by one and make that video an easy go-to whenever you find yourself into an argument, maybe into a conversation where you know there are limiting beliefs and you don't really know what to say to make the person realize they have limiting beliefs, even less get rid of them or at least change them. This video is basically the easy go-to that you can always check again by clicking on the corresponding pattern down below in the description. You can just go to the pattern that is the most relevant based on your case and see how you can apply it. So let's dive in with what Sleight of Mouth is made for. I won't make that video longer than it is required by explaining the whole history behind how Robert Dilts has developed this by modeling Bandler, Erickson, Plateau. Okay, if you are here, you definitely know a bit about the story, about how it was developed. Let's skip that phase right away. What Sleight of Mouth is made for? It is made for two things, basically. The first one is when people disagree with you. I could not explain it more simply than this. And the second thing is when people that you talk to, speak with, have limiting beliefs about themselves, about what they want to accomplish, about their loved ones, whatever they have limiting beliefs, and you know they have limiting beliefs, but you just don't know how to articulate it, how to explain without getting them offended. You don't know how to do that and how potentially to defend yourself if somebody is trying to impose their limitations on you, telling you you can't do this, you will not be able to do that. How do you defend yourself without getting too confrontational either? In the meantime, let's not forget I am also writing a book called Magical Linguistics. That will be a massive simplification of Sleight of Mouth and many breakdowns will be included in that book so that anyone can learn those skills more easily. Now for the patterns. We are going to dive into them one by one. Several of the patterns in the Sleight of Mouth model are similar. They may not be identical, but they are similar and they could be part of the same category. This is why many people get confused when they try to study and learn all of that. They get confused because they are never really sure if this statement or this limiting belief or like this reframing is more this category or this one or that one. They get confused. I will do my best here to dissect all of that and mentioning the similarities and the differences. So how can you differentiate all of those and how can you make that part of your language whenever you interact with another human being? We are simply going to dissect all of them in a circular loop, going in the clockwise movement. First, the intention pattern, the way they have codified it. It is about mentioning what you understand of the intention of your interlocutor or maybe your intention. When somebody is disagreeing with you, is maybe disrespecting you, you might say, listen, my sole intention is to help you. My sole intention is to find a compromise between you and me. Or if somebody is getting really negative and the person just complains, you might say, look, I only see your intention as being somebody who wants to complain. It's like, from my perspective, your intention is only to keep complaining. Am I right? Am I wrong? That might be a bit confrontational, that might be, difficult to process. But at least if the person was just stuck ruminating dirty thoughts, that might also make the conversation moving again. So the intent pattern is about mentioning what you understand of their intention or clarifying what you want them to understand about yours. When they misunderstand what you want to do with them, around them, or in your own life, because they label you a bad person, you might reframe by saying, listen, Joe, my intention is only to succeed in life. And I don't mean to disrespect anybody. I don't mean to cause any harm. If I did, I apologize. I only want to grow in my life. That is my intention. Number 2, the model of the world, which is kind of linked with the intention. It might be part of the same category eventually, except that the model of the world is encapsulating more facts, details, more elements, because the model of the world is about mentioning what is possible, available, doable within your perception of how the world works compared to the perception of somebody who might be more limited or less open-minded than you are. Or on the reverse, you may mention, what I see of your perspective is that you believe in this, which I don't believe in too. It might call to any other person, any other detail, fact that exists in your worldview that does not exist or is considered labeled impossible in the worldview of somebody you are interacting with. In the end, it is just a matter of what you allocate your mental resources to. Some people keep scrolling on the news, seeing what's going wrong, what's going bad today, and they get very infuriated or really negative and pessimistic. You may, on the other side, read only Tony Robbins books and feel motivated all day long because you don't see the news, you only read personal development books. In that case, okay, you have two different models of the world. One person you eventually that thinks things can move forward, that can change, evolve, and somebody who might be overly pessimistic and only looking at potential reasons why everything is fucked up, nothing will ever change. Two different models of the world. In that case, one of the simplest ways to reframe is to explain my perception, my vision is this and this and that. I know that person who is successful. I know that person who has recovered from that kind of problem, whatever. You don't think it is possible. If you want, I can give you details about what I know to be possible that in your perception is currently impossible. Would you be interested into learning about that? And you let them reflect. Number 3, the reality strategy. This one is a bit special in my opinion in that model because it is much more like a very niche NLP topic. I don't really see the reality strategy as an overall linguistic technique used in any kind of debate, in any kind of conversation like most of the other patterns. I see this one as a very narrowed down niche specific NLP technique, which is extremely valuable in a therapy session, in a coaching session, maybe not as valuable in a confrontation or something where the conversation is moving faster because the person might not be your client or your patient and you're in a confrontation. That is more difficult to use that, but if you apply that in therapy, definitely great great options. And if you do that with yourself, like I advised on some other video, you can elaborate on what gets me stuck from the inside, and that might be a great potential for self-reframing. So the reality strategy is basically uncovering the sequence of sensory modalities. I am simplifying to not make that video last too long. Sensory modalities, what's happening inside my head or your head or the head of somebody you are talking to as they get limited by some problem. Do they see themselves getting limited and then they worry, so they get a feeling? In that case, the sequence is visual, internal, kinesthetic, internal. I see something in my head and I get worried. For example, it might be, oh, whenever I hear that person yelling at me, I freeze, I get paralyzed. In that case, auditory, external, kinesthetic, internal, and then I want to punch them in the face, kinesthetic, external eventually, if they do. You see the point, it is about elaborating on the sequence present in the brain of somebody who is limited or annoyed eventually by a problem. It might also be used in modeling when you want to figure out what an expert is doing inside his or her head as they are accomplishing a great prowess, a great task. Eventually, it is about slowing down and deconstructing step by step what's happening in the head of somebody that make them believe this to be true or that to be untrue, for example. Next we have the meta frame, probably one of the most powerful ones of all of them, and like kind of the last resort if you are stuck into a very complex and difficult confrontation. You can distance yourself from the conflict potentially at hand, or you can take on a higher authority metaphorically in the conversation by using a meta-frame pattern. In science, in communication, in therapy, the term going meta usually typically refers to take some distance and take some outside or above perspective on the matter at hand. You may, for example, a meta-frame pattern, you may mention what you are witnessing from the behavior of the person you are interacting with. If you said something and the person is getting more agitated and speaking faster, you can, instead of reacting to their emotional garbage, you can just pause, reflect, and say, Johnny, I'm noticing you are right now speaking faster. Did I say anything that annoyed you? So you are distancing yourself from the conversation. That will be extremely valuable if somebody said any mean comment at you, tried to insult you in any sort of way. Taking some distance by using the meta frame. Listen, right now I am witnessing you are getting more aggressive than I have seen you being so far. Did I say anything that offended you? Or right now I can see you are getting away from me. Sometimes people physically kind of get away from the conversation because they are scared, because they sense you are talking about something that is touching their vulnerable emotions, deep feelings, and their body is turning away from you. You can mention that. Listen, Johnny, right now I see your body is turning away. I can see your feet are pointing at the door as if you wanted to leave and run away from me. Did I do or say anything that was conflict that was difficult to hear for you? On the lighter, more positive side, it is definitely of great use too in therapy. If you say, for example, listen, Mark, right now we have been talking for like 15 minutes, and whenever I talk about your girlfriend or your mother or whatever, I can notice you take a deep breath and you start speaking slower. Is there something really positive you would like to mention about your girlfriend, your mother, whoever? Is there anything you want to mention about that? Same thing, you are taking a meta-frame perspective on what is happening. So far I only talked about the body language of things which may be easier for people to notice. On the more advanced side, it is also about linguistic strategies. If somebody is trying to get me stuck into one side of an argument by narrowing down to only details that satisfy their narrative about what they want me to do, I can point that out. Hey motherfucker, you have been asking questions only to get me stuck into the version of reality you consider relevant. No, I can get out of this and point out to my facts that will contradict what you have been saying so far. The apply to self pattern, potentially the most technical and maybe the trickiest of them all, because right now we are getting really into linguistics, like really deeply, at least I think so. The apply to self is extremely common, you already know it is extremely common in self-help quotes. You see that in many empowering personal development quotes all over the internet. For example, you have the quote, reasonable men are the ones who adapt to the world, and unreasonable men are the ones who adapt the world to them. So we use the same criteria, the same part of the sentence, being reasonable, that is the main criteria here, since being reasonable is often mentioned as something as a positive value for, like stay realistic, yeah, fine. Realistic people, we can say the same thing about being realistic. Realistic people are the ones who adapt themselves to the world. Unrealistic people are the ones who adapt the world to their dreams and wishes. And people like Steve Jobs have been unrealistic people from the day they were born, probably. Another one might be, even though no life exists without love, no love demands that you give up your own life. So we use the exact same words and we contradict the meaning of the initial statement by applying a different meaning to the same word. Which is, I know, very technical, it depends on your level of experience with linguistics, but it is something you can use in simpler ways by only using the same term somebody has been using against you, maybe, or you might shift to the meta-frame perspective if, for example, somebody says people around me are just stuck and stubborn, and you might call them out by saying, don't you think it is a stubborn way of noticing what people do around you? That might be confrontational depending on the context and depending on who is the person you are saying that to. Nonetheless, it is very useful to make people reflect upon themselves and upon their own limitations, simply because any word of the human language, of human languages, any word is loaded or not loaded on a spectrum of emotions. Some words for you have a strong connotation, typically love, power, confidence, money, all of those big words. Any other words may have a strong connotation, and some words are just useless for you, emotionally speaking. If you want to make somebody reflect upon themselves, that will be very useful to use the exact same words they are using in a different way, in a different meaning, in a different scenario. That is the apply to self. You apply back to the sender the criteria that they have used against you or to correlate some event with some negative connotation. Basically, you ask yourself, when you want to use the apply to self, you ask yourself, how can this same thing contradict itself? Next, we have the change of frame size, which I admit to me is just already contained in the consequence pattern and the model of the world. If you master model of the world and consequence, I don't really see what else you learn from the change of frame size that is not already contained in those two. But basically, the change of frame size is using, for example, another time frame, other people, other facts within that context. We might eventually say it has thread to what Bandler and Grinder were naming the context reframing. You shift the context in a way that will provide a counter example to what the person in front of you is saying. So the change of frame size is what you hear whenever you have eventually a disagreement. Some people don't really understand each other and they disagree. They keep saying, yes, and what about that? And what about that? Classic example, socialism against capitalism. Both of them will preach for their own beliefs, and the socialist person might say, yeah, and what about the poor workers who are exploited in the poor countries? And the capitalist might say, yes, and what about the economic downfall? And if we don't build more companies and remove the tax structure, all the companies will fall. Same thing, you're just taking two different aspects of the same situation, which is always too broad and complex to be mentioned in only one sentence. So during a discussion, we naturally shift to different aspects of the conversation, and if people are in a confrontation, they will naturally try to use more of the facts that build up their own assertiveness in their beliefs. The other person might do the same. That is kind of the dead end if people just keep giving counterexamples back and forth. Usually the best thing to do is to go dive into the model of the world of the person who is in confrontation with you and really go into the specifics, into the chunking down that we will see later, to figure out the micro elements of what they believe in. And from there, the reframing is easier. If you try to reframe just by calling different facts, I don't think it is such a great strategy. Nonetheless, the change of frame size can be relevant when we talk about time frames. One of the easiest ways of using this pattern is by saying you may be disappointed right now because you didn't get the gold medal, and if we look at this on the longer time frame, maybe 3 years from now, you will not even care about it anymore because you will have developed more skills, you will be a better competitor, you will have more athletic skills, skills, whatever you want to say, you can just point out to something else that will be positive on the longer time frame, which again is kind of the same thing as consequence patterns, so I don't really see why Diels wanted to make this separate category, but if you really want to study them one by one, that is the point, you enlarge the context, the frame, to broader and different elements than only what the person is getting themselves stuck into mentally and emotionally. Next, we have the hierarchy of criteria, which I would have put in the model of the world too, but it is a separate category here, and this one is very simple, pretty easy to use. You might start using it right now if you want to start by some of the easiest patterns in that model. The hierarchy of criteria is what we might refer to as the value system. What is more important? What is more relevant? In politics, obviously, that is used every day because the people are more important for the socialist. No, the money is more important for the capitalist. In the end, it is mostly about your belief system, your value system. What do you allocate more importance to? And many debates, whether they talk about financials, politics, or anything else, many debates we see on the internet might be resumed to only this pattern, because people just are in a battle by saying what is more important, what is more relevant. In the end, at least my personal belief is that what is more relevant is only subjective. You may think this or that is more relevant. That is just your belief system, and I am fine with it as long as you don't try to impose it on other people who did not ask for it. Next, we have the consequence pattern, therefore, that has been kind of covered into other patterns. The consequence pattern is, the simplest way I like to mention that, is what will happen later. Post-hypnotic suggestions in the world of hypnosis are all part of the consequence pattern, if we want to explain it that way. The consequence pattern will be shifting the attention to what may or will happen later. 2 days from now, I can envision a very positive change for you. Years from now, after you have gotten past all your blockages and limitations, Johnny, you will figure out that people actually love you because you have grown out and away from your insecurities by this point, and in that future, a few months or years from now, you may find the love of your life. That is the kind of easy post-hypnotic suggestions many hypnotists will use with their patients. That is basically the consequence pattern. Another way of using that is again more, close and confrontational, is to point out to a negative consequence. And same thing in debates, we hear that all the time when, again, socialist, capitalist, they all do that now all the time by saying, if we vote for this president, if we elect this person, the country is going to be destroyed. They both say it for different reasons, based on their values and their belief systems, but they both say it. They both say that if this president gets elected, the country is broken, is dead. No, if that president is getting elected, the country will be dead. They keep saying the same thing. They both use the consequence pattern because they want to point out to the fact that what they don't like will lead to a negative consequence. In that case, by the way, on the side note, if somebody keeps annoying you with that kind of statement, you simply ask them, how do you know that? And you keep digging into the facts and details until you find a fallacy that they were not prepared for. That is a bit more advanced, maybe other videos on that later if you want. Next, we have the redefine, which may be the essence of reframing. I would even argue that if you master the redefine, you master all of them, technically, because it is about calling one thing another thing. The redefine is what Bandler and Grinder again called the content reframing, or I make some simplification here, but it is very linked to what they called the content reframing. It is about calling one thing another thing. This is not X, this is Y. I did not yell at you, I taught you a lesson. I am not trying to use YouTube to make money, I am teaching you things that will be relevant for you. Well, both of those versions are true. It is just about which one do we allocate more mental resources to? Which one of them do we want to look more at? And if somebody hates me, they will say, oh, I'm only doing that to make money. If somebody loves me, they will say, oh, Matteo is teaching great things. I learned a lot with his content. That depends, and you have the right to love me, you have the right to hate me, I don't care, like whatever, you have your opinion, whatever. It is just that process at hand. When people like something or don't like something, they will use the redefine, they will redefine it into another version of the same events, facts, details, and people. Another version to describe those things. Another common example of this in therapy, no, you are not, I'm sorry, you are not broken, you are not depressed, you are in the process of recovering. You are not broken, you are learning. You are learning how to recover. Same thing, like that might be two versions of the same person who might be described as a broken person. If we take the very old psychoanalysis model, some psychoanalysts back then were really extremely critical of their patients. I'm not even joking, some of them were really like that. They were critical of their patients and labeling them destroyed person, a broken person. And then we have the Ericksonian people and some more cognitive behavioral therapy that came into play, saying that no one is broken. We simply have people who have learned the skills to cope with their stress or their trauma, and people who did not learn that yet. Which one is true? None of them. It is just about what you want to believe in. Redefining. Another outcome, which to me is really the same thing as consequence and intent. If you master intent and consequence patterns, I don't really see what else you are learning from the another outcome one, but let's say it is different. Another outcome is about shifting the attention to another outcome. Therefore, if you have a patient in therapy who is addicted to cigarettes, to porn, to chocolate, to whatever, you may simply ask that person, what if your outcome was not to suppress those things, your outcome was to replace them with something more positive? Maybe you could replace them with a smaller version. Maybe you can't stop cigarettes right now. Maybe you can't stop watching porn right now. Maybe you can replace those things by another stimulation that is similar but less destructive in your life. Another outcome. You may have another direction in mind by now. I think it is just kind of the same as the intent, because when you talk with a patient in therapy, obviously you are going to help them envision a better intention for their life. If you want to make them move forward, they have to have a strong intention about some goals they want to put in place. So the intent is kind of the same as the another outcome for me. And if you point out to something that will happen in the future, then obviously you are calling out to the consequence, because it is later, not right now, but later. But that is just to give some clarification. If you think it is really different, then study that pattern as a different thing. I tend to think it is kind of the same as the other ones. Next we have the metaphors or the analogies, another pretty intricate one. The metaphor is what has been popularized mostly by Milton Erickson and later Richard Bandler. The metaphors or nested loops or any kind of storytelling are about finding a parallel thinking, a lateral chunking to what is being said. If you go into deductive thinking, you go below into more specific information. This has been causing this and that, therefore the blah blah blah. If you go induction, this was the origin for that, and above that this happened before and that caused this. That might be two sides of the thinking process, going up or going down. And if you want to link that with NLP, Milton model up, meta model down, to simplify a bit of things. And the metaphors are not up, not below, but on the sides. Lateral chunking, not what is more abstract and more general, not what is more specific and more critical details, but on the sides, what is similar? What is it like? What is the same thing in a different context again? So an example of a metaphor for somebody who might have trouble to get more confident at work. For example, let's say this is a computer engineer or some accountant, and that person is kind of getting shit on at his job because no one really respects him. And the metaphor I might use in that context based on the preferences and the values of that person. But let's say I have evaluated the profile of that person and I notice they have some artistic desires. I might use the metaphor, the analogy of an artist I read about recently, an artist from the 19th century. He was an opera singer, yes, professional singer, and the first few times he tried to get up on stage, he was paralyzed by fear, impossible to get any note out of his mouth. After he trained for a while, at some point he discovered by getting more relaxed just before getting on stage, his performance was incredibly more eloquent, more resonant. And after practicing that relaxation technique, he ended up getting a lot of applause from the crowd because everyone was delighted about what he did and the way he could sing those difficult songs. After all of that, his confidence grew. And at some point, he did not even need to get more relaxed before getting on stage. So that is a metaphor for somebody who is not confident. I take a parallel context, another situation with another person, and I make the person in my story go through the links and the hoops that will make that person evolve into the desired situation I want to get that client into. Obviously, that is the desired situation that client has mentioned out loud. I don't presuppose I know what they need and what they want. I ask them what they want. And if they don't know, I help them clarifying. Once I know what they look for, what they want to change in their life, then I may very easily invent a metaphor like this. If it is something really abstract and really like with monsters and flying dragons, I may only do that in a deep hypnotic induction, in a deep hypnotic process. If it is something like I just said right here with an artist from the 19th century, I might say that directly in a conversation because there is nothing you can't believe about what I just said. Somebody is singing on stage, well, that's pretty normal context. So those are things I might use in a conversation very easily. You just think about what is another situation in which similar things are happening, and that will give you your analogy, your metaphor to help somebody who might again be stuck in a negative, pessimistic view of life. Next we have the chunking down, and that is pretty known by all of you who have studied the meta model, the original NLP meta model. Chunking down is about getting more specific. Again, deductive thinking, getting more specifically into the micro components, microscopic components, details, facts, numbers, and placement of the situation being discussed. If you don't clearly understand how somebody made a judgment of any kind, you might tell them, how do you know that? Or who are the people you have seen that were examples of that? Because I don't know any, can you please, for me, clarify who is an example of this thing you say is true that I don't believe in? Or the reverse, you say it is not true, I am going to specify one counter example, which may be part of my model of the world. So if you don't believe playing with your internal states will get you more productive, well, I can tell you about a guy named Tony Robbins that I have used the book of, and based on my experience, obviously I got way more productive by using the internal states conditioning he's talking about in chapter 6 of the book Unlimited Power, for example, and I can give many details about that. So if I say that, for example, I have used the chunking down because I go more specifically into the name of the book, who is the person I'm referring to, and the name of the techniques eventually, sub-modalities, anchoring if I want to really get down into the details. I have used the model of the world because I talk about somebody else, eventually also the change of frame size, and that was kind of also a metaphor because I talk about a parallel situation, mine, where I have been able to change the thing the person might argue with me about because they say it is impossible. All of those patterns may be used at the same time once you get fluent with that. But to finish on the chunk down, it is any kind of facts, details, numbers, any more precise information that is kind of unclear. If the person says, I am stuck on my job, or like people hate me at my job, well, people hate you. Like, do you have one example? One specific example of somebody who hates you. I can never change. Well, do you have one example of a situation where you have tried to change and it did not work? What did you try so far? How many? How many attempts have you made at quitting cigarettes? Only 2. Okay, let's clarify. What did you do during those 2 attempts at quitting? And from there we may elaborate on a solution that will bypass the reasons why it did not work so far for you. Next we have the chunking up. The chunking up is the generalization. We talked about inductive thinking, induction going more general, more abstract. This is also the point of the chunking up, the technique to go in a more generalized aspect of the situation. And you may see that many times used by comedians or in any kind of provocative therapy, because it is also about exaggerating. I use that many times when, for example, my personal views on polyamory and monogamous relationships that don't work in many cases. For me, they work in some cases and they don't work in many cases. And when I used to say that, I got confronted like all the time by girls mostly who said, yeah, and only narcissists want to have multiple partners. You're a narcissist. Blah, 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 blah. And I say, okay, so just because a guy wants to have more freedom, that means he's a bad person. So every possible guy on earth who has dated more than one woman in his life was a fucked up narcissist. Basically, that's what you're saying. And when I exaggerate her sayings that much, obviously she says, no, it's not like this, but then she kind of get into the, not the victim, but kind of the defender position where she has to prove something. And anybody who gets in the position where they have to defend themselves and prove, they are already in the lower position compared to you, which is also about the meta frame. But it is about seeing where the person wants to get you stuck, if it is an argument, and keeping the lead. Keep having the lead. If they want to label you something negative, whereas they barely even know you, which was the case of those women who barely even knew me, and they label me a narcissist, where I'm like, yeah, you don't even know who I am, so how can you label me with just a simple statement I made without knowing my whole personality, my whole identity? I did not accept or tolerate that. So I challenged them, saying on the opposite, okay, so every woman on earth who has had more than one partner is a slut, basically. That's what you're saying, based on what they were saying. And obviously that is not what they believe, but then they have to prove why it is not what they believe, and I keep pushing on the button. Oh yeah, and what about this, and what about that? And they get into the defensive position, which means, well, I am leading the conversation, I am not being swallowed by another person's belief system. And finally we have the counter example, which I am not sure if I really need to explain what it is, because we have had 30-40 minutes already of counterexamples in this video. So it is just an assembly of all the other patterns to me. The counterexample is another thing that did not fit previously in the model of the world of the person you are interacting with. They wanted to maintain their attention only on certain facts, details, and people in the situation, and you are giving an example that fits that comes from your model of the world and not theirs. Not yet, at least. By giving a counterexample, obviously you are helping them to reflect upon the fact that not all the things they used to believe so far were completely true. Some things were true, some things could be put into perspective very easily. So with that we have an assembly, a good introduction to all the patterns one by one. From there, either you can come back to this video whenever you want, because you will have had to handle a conversation that didn't really go well, either in your job as a coach, as a therapist, or maybe in your personal life and you get confronted and you lost the words, you didn't really know how to react. You can just come back to this video and notice, okay, what could I have done differently? And for those who really want to get more in-depth into how do we master all of those, how do we practice, and how do we make all of that automatic, I have different courses. The most complete of them all is the Sleight of Mouth Encyclopedia. And before that, if you don't want to invest and you only want to keep learning with a few techniques here and there one at a time, you can also download down below in the description the 7 steps to master Sleight of Mouth, which obviously won't make you master it right away, but it is a catchy title to help you get into the motivation of practicing. All of that is about practicing. It is not a new language, however, it is new automations. It is a new sequence of linguistic structures that you will need to automate before you can master this. And in the document down below, you will find a few of those connections, a few of those automations that I suggest from experience to make you integrate all of those patterns into your daily conversations much more easily. With that being said, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. Leave some comments if you have some questions on that. And in any case, see you soon in the next video.